This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 382, Automated Ally Testing with Nightwatch. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we were talking about Ally Test Automation with Nightwatch with Daniel Mundra and Ben Mullins. Daniel is an associate director and Drupal backend engineer and participates in the Civic Actions Accessibility Practice area. He is interested in improving how accessibility testing is included in our projects and community. Ben has been working with Drupal since 2012. He joined Acquia's Drupal acceleration team at the beginning of 2019 and is a Drupal core committer and front-end framework manager and accessibility maintainer. He also teaches a JavaScript course at the University of Michigan School of Information. Daniel and Ben, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Hi, thank you.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are John Picozzi, Solution Architect at EPAM. Welcome to the show.
Hi, everyone.
And also joining us, Stephen Cross, Talking Drupal founder and Drupal developer. Welcome to the show.
Hey, happy to be here. For those watching, I'm wearing my mid-camp beanie today, so thank you, mid-camp.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's bring in Martin Anderson-Klutz, Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia and maintainer of a number of modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Today we're going to be talking about the Whoops integration module. Now, to be clear, the machine name of this one is Whoops. There's actually a separate project called Whoops Error Handler, which is D7 only. Really what it does is it integrates a library to show more detailed error reporting for better debugging. Now, the module was created in June of 2016, and the current release is a 2.0 beta 1, which was released in December to provide Drupal 10 readiness. The module has been updated, I would say, over the years. It's sporadically updated, but definitely ready for Drupal 10 with that recent release. Actually has no open issues, and it's currently in use by 101 websites. Now, the maintainer, apologies to the maintainer if I mispronounce his name, but it looks like Ilke Bloke, who nominated the module in the Talking Drupal channel on the Drupal Slack. Now, the way the module works is within the error reporting, it not only shows the stack trace like you would get with your standard watchdog, but it also allows you for each of those lines in the stack trace to actually see the code that was referenced for every step. And additionally, it will list out, kind of environment and other details like your get and post data that were part of the request, session or cookie data, and so on. So it really provides a much richer ability to kind of troubleshoot and drill into different errors that might be reported, all directly within the Drupal UI. Obviously, because of the amount of information that's showing, in particular, kind of the code that the site is using, it's not something that should be used in a production environment. So, when you require it with Composer, better to use the dev flag, and then potentially use something like config split to make sure that, even if the module makes it up to production, that it won't be enabled. So that being said, anyone have any thoughts about the Whoops module?
Yeah, as you said, there's been some discussion about this in the Talking Drupal Slack channel, but I'm definitely going to have to check this out. I mean, even just the convenience of being able to see the code directly is huge. I mean, I'm forever like looking at a stack trace and then we go, okay, let me find that code, especially if it's not code that I've written. If it's a custom module that I've written, like that's usually easier to find and figure out what I did wrong. But when you're digging into something for core, for a contributed module or something, having that direct reference can be, I think, is critical. So I think I'm going to be installing this on a couple of projects in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's definitely something I wanted to start using more and more for, module development and so on. Just as you say, the ability to see the code directly in line, understand what it's doing, and I think that it's going to be super helpful in terms of understanding, where the problem actually lies, because sometimes it's not in, the top of the stack. It can be further down in terms of where the actual problem is.
Oh, thank you, Martin. And on to our primary topic. Okay, so let's start with kind of maybe an easy question, Ben. let's break down the topic a little bit and start with what is Nightwatch? Before we get into the accessibility side of things, what does Nightwatch do?
So Nightwatch is an automated testing tool that's written in JavaScript and is largely designed but not limited to performing end-to-end testing. So, working on an actual page as if a human would be interacting with it. And its usefulness to Drupal is most things you could do in Nightwatch would be possible in the functional JavaScript tests via PHP, but they're a lot more direct, particularly if you want to interact with the JavaScript console. And if you, and then you're running JavaScript, so there's built-in things in the language that are optimized for. If you want to run a promise in a PHP test, you're out of luck, for example. Yeah. So it's an ability to leverage JavaScript and more easily access JavaScript in Drupal tests. There's not a whole lot of tests in Drupal core currently using it, but the ones that are there would be much more difficult, if not impossible, to have been written in functional JavaScript PHP tests.
Okay. Anything to add to that, Daniel?
No, that covers it quite well.
So I think you just touched on this a little bit, Ben, but can you elaborate a little bit on Nightwatch and its integration with Drupal?
Yes. Okay. So the Nightwatch integration, it's part of Drupal core's test suite. So when we deploy any patch or when we run our, once a day, once an hour tests, an hour's worth of tests are run. So there's PHP unit tests, and then it goes up the chain. So there's kernel tests, which are still PHP tests, but they actually engage Drupal Bootstrap. So you can run Drupal things, but there's no UI to test or anything like that. There's functional tests, which engage the UI, but JavaScript doesn't exist. So it's, a late 1990s browser that it's running on. Much faster. Then there's functional JavaScript testing, but it's executed by PHP. And then there's the fifth test, which is the Nightwatch tests. And all of those run every time you deploy. There's in all of your Drupal code bases, you'll see a Drupal CI.yml, and it'll show all those types of tests, how they're configured to run. And so we try to have test coverage for every possible scenario, every feature in Drupal core. And based on what's being tested, we try to choose the test type that's most suitable and add that to the testing suite that consumes roughly an hour for every change we make.
So for the guy that doesn't know anything about Nightwatch or very little about Nightwatch, these tests we're talking about Drupal core, obviously. So you can see kind of a little bit of these tests within the code base, right? And then the tests themselves are running on the Drupal infrastructure, the Drupal core infrastructure, right?
Yes.
And I'm assuming, is there some sort of output somewhere that you can see from these tests?
Yeah, there is. So it is if you go into core tests, that might be missing a directory, but you ultimately get to Nightwatch. And so the code is all there. The test output, if you are looking at Drupal CI's output, which, if you haven't had the opportunity to look at it, you might be, that might be a good thing. It's elaborate. It takes a long time for it to come out, but the Nightwatch test results are included in that output. They are the last tests run as well, so that's an easy way to find them. But the test output is fairly clear that it's Nightwatch tests. You can also run them locally. So if you're in the core directory, you do yarn test : Nightwatch, and that will run them. If anybody listening tries to do that now, you might get a complaint about being enabled. There's certain things that need to be set up in order for that to work. And we may get into this later, but something like Cypress kind of takes care of that without all that config being necessary. But Nightwatch is what we have. And so you can run them locally like any test. And like any test, it requires more setup than I'd care to admit. but it's just part of the test suite. But what's really nice is if you're a JavaScript developer, you don't have to learn PHP to write your tests. You can write them in JavaScript, and that's very handy.
Hey, Ben,
Daniel, anything to add there?
Yeah, I did want to add that all the tests, including Nightwatch, not just in core, right? It's also available to contrib modules to build on. So you can add like a Nightwatch test to your contrib module, especially if your contrib module is like JavaScript heavier, or it's like you want to test more of the front end UI behavior. So that's a really nice part that I'll get into then how accessibility would fit into.
Yeah. And I can call out a specific test example to give you an idea of what kinds of things are in Nightwatch. So I just went to the directory that you said, which is core tests Drupal Nightwatch. And there's one for Ajax execution order test. And what that does is it installs Drupal, logs in as an admin, goes to the module page in Drupal, looks for the search module, enables it, and then first of all, it confirms that when you type in search, you get that little Ajax response, and then it enables that module and then makes sure that you get the confirmation page to say, hey, if you install this module, you're installing these other ones, and then it finishes that test. So that's the kind of thing, like that's the kind of interaction that we're testing. We're not testing, hey, this code, if you put 1 and 1 in, you get 2 out of it, right? You're testing, if you click here, you type this in, you see this, and then you hit this button, you see this other thing. And it's pretty, I've never looked at a Nightwatch test, but it's pretty clear what's happening.
Yes,
I mean, it's very readable. It does kind of look familiar to a lot of other test formats, like Behat, you can tag it with things, it looks like. And it's pretty logical structure.
What type of coverage is there for this type of test? Is it doing anonymous user tests, or is it also doing admin side testing?
You can do both. You can do anonymous user testing as well as admin. I think in some of the Nightwatch examples, you do a before where you either log in as an admin and then do your tests, or create a user, test as that user. So it can definitely cover both.
And something to add there is that we'll probably get into this as we discuss the alley issue as well, is that one obstacle to writing Nightwatch tests in Drupal was that unlike the PHP tests, there were not a lot of built-in functions for doing very common actions such as enabling a theme, enabling a module. So not only were we manually going into the various areas and clicking them, we were also subject to potential timing issues that would stop that common task from happening successfully. So one thing that I've introduced in this, hopefully will be committed soon, alley issue, is that we wanted to enable themes. And so that meant we could either come up with a custom command that went through all the manual steps of enabling the theme, which the process of enabling a theme is not relevant to the test. We just want the theme enabled. So in the install profile for Nightwatch tests, which is only run during tests, it's not something you can enable as a user. I set up endpoints where you just go to the endpoint and request the theme you want enabled, and it does it all under the hood. You don't have to add a bunch of manual clicks to a test that consumes resources that you don't need to consume, and you don't have to worry about security issues because it's the test profile. It's not a site that's actually running. But that has been something that I think has made Nightwatch tests slower to adopt, is because common tasks aren't wrapped into a helpful function already.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I would imagine that also makes the test faster to run, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Great.
So these tests are running. These tests are running right now. Who is writing the test scripts for this? Running on Drupal.org. Who is it?
I mean, it would be whoever. Like, technically, it would be whoever is, whoever's participating in the issue and has determined that issue would be best suited for Nightwatch test coverage. I find in many cases it winds up being someone on my team, and I don't know. I don't know if the documentation's great for Nightwatch. This may be a lot of people's first exposure to anything beyond the word Nightwatch as it pertains to Drupal, and I think that the blame can be partially just the information about it is not easy to find. But for example, Daniel jumped in when we were working on this alley issue and just started writing it. It was, which was fantastic. And I don't know if you'd written the Nightwatch tests before, but yeah, I mean, it was the kind of work we'd hoped to see.
My experience mostly came from Cypress. So I'd done a lot of Cypress testing at Civic Actions. All our projects have Cypress tests. So I knew what the demands were. Like you needed Chrome driver, you needed these dependencies. So when I started looking at Nightwatch, I started looking at like, okay, how are the dependencies added, especially for local development? So shout out, I put a link in the resources to like Matt Glaman's blog. So he talks about how to get DDev, how to get Chrome driver with DDev, and then how do you run the Nightwatch tests and functional JavaScript tests. That was a good, essentially, step for me to be, okay, now I can have a local sandbox to be able to now start writing a Nightwatch test. So that was a good hurdle to get over, and then looking at accessibility and how those tests would be written.
So if I wanted to run Nightwatch locally or include it into my project builds, where does it fit into the workflow, and how do I make that happen?
Yeah, so where it fit in the workflow, I would say like if it's DDev or something like that, finding a good Chrome driver or easy dependency to add that, easy setup to add those dependencies. It's the first step. Once you have that running, then it's just simply installing using yarn and package manager, installing everything else, and then just running yarn run command to run that test. It is since it's end-to-end, as Ben mentioned, the setup is slow, so it takes a little bit longer to run. So it's like that. So you're running these tests and you're going to give it 5 to 10 minutes every time you execute it, but it is runnable locally. Just takes a little bit longer.
Do you also include it in your CI process, or do you just run it locally?
I, as much as possible, try to include it in the CI process. Depending, so in one project that I'm on right now, we have 180 Cypress tests, but right now our math for that is like it's about a 40-minute pipeline run. And our project is not high intense. We're not doing many merge requests, so that timeline works for us. But I could see that as a blocker for other projects. So Cypress itself has parallelization parts of it. Nightwatch would be something to look at about how do you run only tests you maybe changed instead of maybe running the whole suite, depending on your pipeline, or also still having a step where you do run the entire pipeline.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen, that's a pretty hot topic, but I've seen a lot of, if you have a higher velocity project, usually you do a lot more tagging for tests. So you can say, hey, run only these tests. And then you have something maybe nightly, you run all the tests on, you know, whatever, or if you're having a release, you run all the tests before it goes out. But I think that's the most common way of managing that. And that kind of raises the question for me. How long has Nightwatch been part of the Drupal core CI process? Is it, how long has that been part of core?
And I'm going to tag on to that question is, does anyone know why Nightwatch was selected as the tool?
Okay, I might have this wrong, but people love pointing out incorrect things on the internet, so have at it. I believe it was 2016. And then I was not witness to any of that, but I recall that roughly being what it was. It might have even been a little after that, but it was Drupal 8 had been out for a little while, I believe, and then that Nightwatch got added. And I don't recall the rationale. I think I'm sure part of it was just that to empower people who are more comfortable with JavaScript than PHP to be able to write test coverage. Because certainly there's a lot of JavaScript developers out there, and I know that engaging JavaScript developers has been something of interest with many of Drupal's initiatives. So I am speculating a little bit, but I imagine that was part of it, is to just open the tent a little bit to people doing things in different languages.
And it was before Cypress started gathering steam, I imagine, too, right?
I believe so. I remember my first exposure to Cypress would have been 2018. I don't know how new it was at that time, but that when I heard about it from one person, I heard about it from multiple people. And I think Daniel and I are maybe in agreement that we both like Cypress quite a bit. And in fact, that's what I use for all of our auto graders in our course. And I've been able to point students at Cypress who have literally never written a test in their life, and they're actually writing working tests in less than an hour. And yeah, it's really amazing. I've not run into that with Nightwatch, but I've also noticed Nightwatches, if you look at their release notes, they are rapidly adding functionality that resembles Cypress quite a bit. So I think they have acknowledged some of the successes that Cypress has had, and implementing it themselves. And actually Nightwatch in general has been expanding quite a bit in the past year or two, and doing something Cypress can't. But anyways, that's for later. That's
okay.
So I actually just want to clarify something again, probably a dumb question, but that's kind of what I'm good for. Nightwatch just front end like JS tests, right? We talked earlier, Nick highlighted the fact that it's not doing any like PHP unit tests or any back-end code tests, right? So it's simply just doing like anything that you can see in a browser. Is that fair?
not entirely. So you can do JavaScript unit testing with it. And a little bit of CK Editor 5's testing is in Nightwatch, and it's approached as a unit test.
Got it. Okay.
I forget what technical limitation it is, but the way that Nightwatch recommends performing JavaScript unit tests is something that's not supported in the manner Drupal uses it. So we had to kind of Frankenstein unit tests, but they were.
Got it.
I'll just add that I think Nightwatch and Cypress are getting more into the component testing realm as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're thinking about like React components, is if you have that component architecture, I think these tests can be written just to load up a component and just test that in isolation without bootstrapping everything.
Interesting. Says the guy that loves components.
Not React components, just native JavaScript web components. But
all components are created equal, Nick. Change my mind. Anyway, let's jump into the accessibility part of this conversation, right? So I think we have a pretty good idea of how Nightwatch works with Drupal, what Nightwatch does, right? Let's switch focus a little bit and just talk about automated ally testing in general. And Daniel, I'm going to focus this question to you. What types of automated ally testing do you usually do for a site or project?
Yeah, so I'll talk about it in terms of like layering. So the one layer of testing is take a production site, take maybe a sitemap or a set of URLs, and a go-to is Pally CI with Axe. The nice thing about that is you can give it a sitemap, you give it a list of URLs, and it just goes, visits all of them and gives you this reporting about it, explaining what the errors are, where it exists on the page, so you can go debug it. The nice thing about that, again, you can give a sitemap, so it really covers all the site. It does have a little bit of interactivity where you can do a little bit of authentication, a little bit of like clicking around. But when it comes to a sitemap, that's harder to set up when it's a lot of URLs. But if you have few URLs, you can do that. So Pally covers that. I would recommend it for a production site, run it daily, weekly, and then run the reports, review the reports, and audit your site that way. But that's, again, less interactivity. You're just doing the entire site. So the next level from that would be Cypress Nightwatch, where you can do URLs page, but Cypress and Nightwatch are more specific on like, let's take a page, a component, a particular spot on a form, and let's test that for accessibility. And I would say test states, right? Like, so if you have a drop-down field, you're introducing a new field, like a select feature that you have search and something that's very JavaScripty, you want to make sure it's accessible, right? So you want to write your test that's just focusing on that drop-down. and you can then interact with it, saying like, okay, click on it, it pops up, you start typing some search text in it, it tests it, is it accessible, is it doing the right ARIA labeling, stuff like that. So that's where you can really focus in on your Cypress test. I would call it like accessibility sort of like unit tests, where you're like adding it to those features and building it together, and then checking that, okay, if all my form fields are accessible, now I can say the form is accessible, I can check for that. And then I can check the page to make sure it's accessible. Yeah.
So you're kind of rolling your own per project as opposed to how you automate ally testing. There's no like, I don't know, set list of like, hey, I'm always going to run these tests, making sure every image has a alt attribute, making sure, ARIA labels are applied correctly to form fields. Like, are those like, obviously those are the types of things that you can automate, right?
Mm-hmm.
But are those things that you're setting up regularly with automated testing?
Yeah, I would say Pally that's where that majority of that comes from, where it is checking for alt text, is checking a lot of the WCAG criteria. The disclaimer here is that automated testing for accessibility catches 30 to 50%. That's the tagline you'll hear. That's true. It's getting better over time, but that's the amount you can expect to catch right now. Yeah, so it's going to catch a lot of the WCAG criteria, catch like, are you missing headings? Are you applying ARIA roles the right way or incorrectly? Yeah, Pally, most of that. Cypress, you can do that as well. And then Cypress Axe as well has a plugin. And then with Nightwatch and Axe will report on all of those issues. And the nice thing about Axe is Axe has both WCAG, all the WCAG requirements, but also best practices that DQ has written for accessibility. And they tout their thing about being the least false positive for their testing. Because we might get to that, which is accessibility testing is going to be a chicken and egg. It's going to be a game of like, you run it right now, you might have a lot of errors to deal with. And now are you going to gateway your pipeline with your test? Because now you'll have to fix all these accessibility issues. So we do check for that as well, with balancing that with interactivity.
Okay.
So the benefits of using this is I think saving time, saving effort, and like a jumping point for things you need to look at, right?
Mm-hmm. And
what do you think the impact of that is?
I would say like the what comes to mind, which is like, historically accessibility testing has always been left at the end of a project, at the end of a launch. So you'll hear the term shift left, right? So the impact here is, let's make it easier for you to write tests. So you're doing it earlier. You're thinking about it as soon as you write new functionality, right? So you're shifting left as much as possible. And you're catching those errors, right? A lot of times you're going to be like catching it only at the end, right? Even Pally is running at the end where the site is in production. The errors are out there. People are already dealing with the site that has potentially accessibility issues. But if you caught them earlier, you would have fixed them and not have launched into production.
Yeah, it's like an early alert. The developer is saying, hey, by the way, which we like to get, hey, you get pinged on, hey, this isn't right, look at it now.
Right.
It's one of those things too, where it's like, you always talk about like testing in general, not just accessibility testing, but like doing it frequently so that you can catch these things before they become bigger issues, right? I think it's one of those things that if you were to integrate this into a CI process, right, it could be like one of those quality gates where you're like, no, you have to fix these issues before you commit this code to the repo, which could potentially be annoying to some, but I mean, I think it's a worthwhile quality gate, right?
Great.
There's one thing that's not clear in my head that you need to clarify is there a function we're running in the Nightwatch script that says, hey, is this accessible? Or are you basically handwriting all of those tests to make sure that, alt text and all this stuff, or is there a general library of functions that you just call?
Yeah, and that's what we get from Axe, which is it is the catch-all. You just say check Axe or something like that, the function name, and it'll either check the entire page or check a particular ID you provided, and it's going to tell you whether that section of HTML is accessible or not. And if it's not accessible, what are the issues?
Yeah, that's what wasn't clear to me, Stephen. And then I read the Pally description, and it said that it's a CI tool that runs through a list of common accessibility issues. And I was like, there it is. That's where the list of things is coming from. And I would assume Axe is probably the same sort of deal.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to clarify: is that piece of it integrated with Core yet, or is that just on your personal projects or projects that you're working on? Is this something you have to integrate yourself, or is it part of the Core pipeline?
It's RTBC, and it's been RTBC for a while, and I may have shot accessibility in the foot by being involved in the issue because I probably was the committer best suited to commit it. But it's been RTBC for, I think, a little over a month.
Okay.
And so hopefully there's momentum on it and it can go forward. But what it would be doing is we've set up an install profile that creates a number of kind of common use case pages, common forms, common what you might run into in a typical site on Drupal core default themes. And then it runs that suite of tests that is built into Nightwatch. And one thing that's worth mentioning is that as a result of implementing this, we did find accessibility errors because we're running automated tests now. And for each of those, we don't want those errors to prevent the tests from being added. So for each item that was discovered, we created a follow-up issue to fix it. And that specific rule is bypassed for the page that it's failing on. So it's an engine to create accessibility issues. That'll be fixed later.
And you have those issues in the show notes already, I think. So we'll make sure that those go out to the listeners. What were you saying, Daniel?
I was just going to add, which is the Nightwatch did add Axe Core in the most recent version, which is nice. So actually in the 10.0 branch right now, you do have Nightwatch with Axe already there. So if someone wanted to add their own accessibility test to a contrib module or to core in another place, they can. The current pull request to at least start with some of what Ben's work is, right? Like having some set of tests and get going for core tests. Okay. But if someone wanted to start using it module tests, which is something I want to start doing as well, if you have the 10 branch, you can start doing that.
Okay. So I guess the next question that I have then is based on some of the discussion we've been having. So right now if you have a known failure, you're just bypassing that accessibility test until those can be cleaned up in the follow-up issues. But I guess the question is, since accessibility is one of the gates for core development, does this then become, once those are resolved, does this become a blocking failure for deploying new features? I imagine the answer is yes.
Yes.
Okay.
That'd be great.
and has there been any, did there need to be any negotiation on that, or was that we already have the accessibility pledge, and so it's just kind of a no-brainer once we backfill the discovered issues?
Yes, it wouldn't be a change to the policy. So it is an existing policy. The difference is that now we have an automated tool that will catch things that might have otherwise been missed.
Okay. I'm curious, what types of issues did it find? What kinds of things did fall through the cracks? Just to kind of highlight the types of things that people listening, because obviously the Drupal core team and the Drupal community in general cares about accessibility. As part of the core pledge, right? That things need to be accessible. and so it shows that even well-meaning, careful people can still miss things. I'm curious, what kinds of things does the automated testing highlight? Just so that, I can look at my own projects like, hey, what did I miss?
Yeah. I'll give you a quick rundown of it.
Sure.
So, for example, on the home page or the login page, there's content on those pages that do not have a region assigned to them.
Okay.
And on the search page, the heading there's a heading order issue. So there's the
Okay.
and then there's also an issue with a duplicate IDs. So that's actually a pretty bad one.
Yeah.
So
I did get a report from somebody on the login page actually yesterday. I haven't had a chance to look into it, so I don't know if it's the Gin admin theme or core or something that I did, which isn't out of the realm of possibility.
Sure.
But enter isn't logging people in after they put their password in. So I would wonder, would the automated accessibility testing catch that as well? Or is that the type of thing that's more functional?
It could potentially catch that, but you would have to have created a page where that problem would be present for it to catch it. And that's one of the challenges, is coming up with sort of representative of what a common Drupal use case would be pages. Because obviously we're not filling it with contents. We're not creating like a bunch of entity reference fields or anything like that. They're very bare bones pages that we're testing. But they still surface, relevant issues.
Interesting.
Yeah, in that particular example, I think it's actually trickier, because if you just see a form and it has a submit input, I think the HTML would pass accessibility, but the enter, like not doing their keyboard navigation, that's a tricky one that might not get caught.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, like I said, I just got the report yesterday. Haven't even had a chance to investigate it and see if it's even actually happening. but I'm just curious about the Nightwatch capability.
I would just add that that's a great TDD example that I would love to write a test to replicate that bug and then pass it.
Okay.
In Cypress, I've done a little bit of experimentation with keyboard navigation. That's like the one thing automated testing is not really there at with keyboard testing, but I'm trying to there's a Cypress plugin for representing key presses. So you sort of mimicking key presses as much as you can. So I'm doing that in Cypress. There's probably going to be a way to do that in Nightwatch. My goal is to if you can do automated keyboard testing, that would solve a lot of issues.
Okay. So do you guys contribute to actually, let me take a step back. Is Nightwatch open source?
Yes.
Yep.
And are you guys contributing back to Nightwatch as well? Or are you just consuming Nightwatch as a test runner for Drupal?
So far, just a consumer. If there was a bug that I caught, I would absolutely do more than just report it. But the opportunity hasn't really come up.
Okay.
Same for me, mostly consumer Cypress, but sharing out as much we can when we find solutions.
Okay.
So throughout our conversation, we've been talking mostly about Drupal core development, Nightwatch being included in Drupal, which obviously is a piece of software, right? Wondering if you would recommend using Nightwatch and this sort of accessibility testing for any type of project, thinking a web project. Most of us are building web projects, right? Web projects have a great deal of accessibility requirements, testing requirements in general. Is that something where you think you would recommend using Nightwatch? And what are some other project types that maybe you have used Nightwatch on?
I would definitely recommend it. Any front-facing website one adding that Nightwatch or Cypress, then if you think of just a standalone website, maybe something like a Jekyll static site, those are actually really easy to get going with Nightwatch and Cypress testing. You just add it to the repo, GitHub and GitLab. You can really get that actions and their pipelines going really quickly to test those sites. With with accessible, like the Axe core, it's just simply, again, you can just start with giving it URLs and just seeing what it reports on and start fixing those issues. But as I said earlier, like then you can also be like more like if your site is doing something interactivity, like it's like a modal pop-up or something you're going to type in that's going to generate results, right? You can start writing a little bit more interactive tests really quickly. Ben's example of his students running with is a great one, right? Like you can really start, you just write like Nightwatch, interact with this element, bring it up, start typing in it. Like that's quick code and you can see those results. And I think Nightwatch, as well as with Cypress, you can generate, I think, videos and like you can see how they're like, how it's running those tests and where it's like, where it's failing, where it's kind of generating errors from.
So I've noticed in this conversation today that every time we say Nightwatch, you guys also add Cypress to it. When you say Cypress, you add Nightwatch to it. So I keep, in my mind, I'm asking myself this question is, those are two different tools, both doing the same kind of thing. So if you are recommending someone to add this type of testing to their project, what tools should they look at? Like, should they look at both? Should they be implementing both as the language in this conversation implies? Or should they be picking one tool to focus on?
I'll give a take. So if you're doing supporting a Drupal module, Nightwatch is probably the best choice because it's already part of the CI workflow. So if you have Nightwatch tests and you push a branch of your contributed module, if it's in the right namespace, it's just going to run them and it's going to use Drupal core's Nightwatch with Drupal core settings. Okay. If you are running, if you have a site for a client and you're not wired into, the Drupal D.O infrastructure, I might recommend Cypress. I do find it's easier to use. It's easier to find answers to your questions. It's really nice. So yes, I'm a full-time Drupal core developer, but I have, no allegiance based on something being in Drupal core. Yeah. Cypress is a well-written framework. And so if you're going to be setting everything up already, if you're in charge of your own infrastructure, the learning curve on Cypress is lower. And there's I think Nightwatch might be catching up to it, but it actually has an Electron-based like standalone application for when you're running tests locally, and it's so well thought out. It's really nice. So yeah, there's pros and cons of both.
So it sounds like if you were starting today with, hey, we need to have a front-end testing framework for Drupal core, you would have gone with Cypress.
Oh yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yep.
So that, the next logical question is there an initiative or discussion about possibly converting at some point, for 11 or for, at some point in the future, or is core kind of like we're on Nightwatch for the foreseeable future?
Like, even though I am kind of in a position where I could make that proposal, and the amount of plumbing.
I know it's a big ask.
Yeah.
Big ask. I'm not saying.
Oh no. So
yeah.
I don't think the return on investment of the change would be that great.
Okay.
But that's one person's subjective, and also from like the skewed perspective of someone who's on the DAT team, we don't know what it's like to make real sites anymore. We're out of touch. But it's but yeah, if we were adding a JavaScript testing framework today, I would be full in on Cypress. That would be what I was pushing.
And the reason why I'm kind of asking that is kind of related to my next question, which is contrib adoption. Core has very good test coverage all the way through, whether it's Nightwatch or just functional tests or unit tests, that kind of stuff. Core has has good test coverage. When you get to contrib, some modules have good test coverage, but it very, very quickly peters off. And one of the issues that I've noticed as we're getting ready for Drupal 10 is a lot of modules are doing the update from 8 to 9 or 9 to 10. They're not updating their tests, right? If Rector is reporting an issue with the test, many of them are just saying, you know what, I'll deal with that later. which is their prerogative. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but they're getting it ready for Drupal 10. They're saying it's Drupal 10 ready, but now their tests don't work, so you don't really know if they've changed functionality, right?
Yeah.
But so one of my questions is, if well, let me start with this. Is there an initiative to try to get better coverage for tests in Contrib for Nightwatch for this kind of testing? Or is it just, the documentation's out there, and if people want to implement it, they do, and if not, they don't?
I'm going to say not that I'm aware of, and then I might challenge your remark about the documentation being out there, because I kind of don't know if it is.
Oh, okay.
Like I think one of the the
Happy to be
Nightwatch
corrected.
testing, yeah, it might. If it is, it's not great, to be honest. Like I think that I don't know what you wouldn't call it even a learning curve, but a lot of things that emerged kind of in the latter 2010s with Drupal, I don't know, are particularly well documented. And I think Nightwatch is among the guilty parties there. And a lot of this could be improved if the resources were better. So like, yeah, if someone said we wanted to improve, we have an initiative and we want to improve JavaScript testing, and someone proposed changing to Cypress, I might counter propose, let's just make Nightwatch testing a little better documented and easy to figure out. And
that kind of brings me to kind of the follow-up question based on the return on investment. I mean, if people are generally gravitating towards Cypress right now for their own projects, and then they could just use that same technology for their contrib modules that they maintain, that lowers that barrier to entry. And that's where the question, I think, starts to become really interesting, is because it's not just core. It also allows people that are used to writing Cypress tests write tests for core too, or an issue that they see. If you lower, there are examples for a lot of tests in core, but it's still a fairly high barrier to entry to writing your own tests. I mean, for example, I've recently, I've been participating a lot with several modules in updating both tests and for Drupal 10. So I've learned how to run a test manually for the first time about a month ago, which was really eye-opening. That's the first time that I found out about Nightwatch myself, actually, because there were a bunch of failures that related to jQuery once, I think, when I was trying to fix that. And then there were a bunch of failures that were just false negatives. They just, for some reason, there was a race condition, and rerunning it made it work. But the point of this question is, there are also other modules, like, for example, Elasticsearch connector, right? They have, because they're using an external service, the test suite there is really complicated, right? So there's a barrier to entry for testing. And so the question is when do you think that balance changes? Like, what would need to change for you to consider changing that framework? Or do you think for the foreseeable future, just document Nightwatch better and people will adopt it?
There's one extra wrinkle to add, is that, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, but Nightwatches has been rapidly improving and adding features, and some of them are just, for example, like syntax that Cypress uses is now like the define and it calls are that syntax are available in Nightwatch now. Now, none of the current core tests use it, but a Nightwatch developer could, or a Cypress developer could more easily use the same syntax in Nightwatch. But granted, that's not obvious either. I learned it from reading a change record. But that reduces the transition curve there. But also, like, Nightwatch's documentation isn't, I feel, as good as Cypress's. So aside from the Drupal documentation, there's a lot of learning curve things, but it is feature wise, it's getting closer and closer.
Okay.
And so then we'd really have to like look at what would it take and how many different gates would we have to go through, how many parts of the Drupal community would need to buy into this. We'd really have to just go through all those considerations before knowing what's the best choice to make. But
so from my simplistic, again, dumb guy sitting here listening to this standpoint, and maybe you can provide some insight into this, but like it sounds like Cypress and Nightwatch are like kind of doing the same thing, and that like Drupal.org or Drupal, the Drupal project doesn't really need to decide. Sounds like maybe Cypress and Nightwatch need to like join forces into Cypress Watch or Night Press or something like that. And
I mean,
like
competition is good. I mean, when there's competition, they push each other.
Spoken like a true developer, Nick. I mean, I think competition is good in some cases, but I mean, where they seem to do the same thing and they seem to like be copying one another, like I don't know. To me, it just sounds like, hey, join forces, build a community around it, and get all of those people in one room and build one really great product instead of two okay products. But
I think they're both great, but yeah, no, I think I see where you're coming from too.
So we've talked a lot about testing products and ally testing on this show in the past 6 months. We had an episode 364, if anyone wants to learn more about Cypress. We also had an episode 371 talking about Equalify. So we've already spoke about Cypress quite a bit. Do you guys have any thoughts about Equalify? Are you familiar with that?
Not familiar.
I'm not.
Okay, so go back and listen to 371. You can learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it qualifies a product that integrates a lot of different accessibility.
Sounds like it's
suites.
integrating the same kinds of back-end tests that we're talking about here.
Yeah, yes. It's integrating a lot of different accessibility test suites into your CI. But it integrates a bunch of the different tools like Axe and Pally and all those together and gives you one report, I think. And it's made to be it's made to be simpler to add accessibility testing to
the CI process specifically.
Nice.
Yeah,
got it.
Yeah, it's not built as a front end tool you run locally. I don't believe it's more of a back end like CI check as you're doing your build process.
Yeah, and to be clear, that show is actually not technically about Equalify. It's just the Equalify founder was the guest.
Yeah.
So Blake Bertuccioli is the developer for Equalify. If you're interested about it, it sounds like Nightwatch is the chosen kind of front end test tool for Core. It sounds like any gaps that were there between it and Cypress are quickly being filled. The main one that exists is documentation. So I guess if somebody's interested in helping with that, what's maybe the best place to start working on documentation?
I linked one page right now. It's a very simple page about JavaScript testing using Nightwatch. That could be expanded. When you start getting into Cypress tests, like you mentioned a race condition example, right? There is a lot more JavaScript testing. You have to think about closures. You have to think about asynchronicity, right? All of those factor in how you write your test, either by forcing execution order, or like balancing out when things are asynchronous. Those are all like the advanced topics, right? So once you start getting JavaScript testing and you have a complicated module, right, where are those references? Does Nightwatch handle that, or does Nightwatch provide you a way of dealing with asynchronous? Like those are the references. More examples probably would help as well. And that's what I want to get into. That my plan. The one like gate is we can't do this in Drupal 9, right? Like with our current, we have to be in 10. So you have to get your module up there with 10 compatible, and then you can start adding these tests.
Okay. And then my next question is, and this comes up whenever we talk about accessibility, especially in the CI, and I probably asked you this, Daniel, in the last episode you were on. So I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on this, Ben, and maybe any follow-up thoughts from you, Daniel. So Ben, when these issues are identified, say I add Nightwatch to my project, or I'm looking at the issues that were identified in Core, what resources do you use to resolve these? Like, how do you figure out the best way to solve the issues? Like Nightwatch and this accessibility testing is great. It helps you identify the issues. How do you resolve them? because it's not always as simple as just making it pass, right? If the accessibility issue obviously is, I mean, the go-to example is alt text, right? If it's failing because there's empty alt text, you can't just put a period in there. That's not going to solve it, right? What resources do you use to make sure that you're properly solving the accessibility issue, rather than just making the test pass?
So if in the future, when this automated tool is available, if a change did trip one of the automated accessibility tests as a failure, whoever is working on the issue should tag it with needs accessibility review. And so then that'll ensure that it doesn't get merged until an accessibility and I'm speaking specifically to core, of course, but that an accessibility maintainer such as myself would have to review it and approve of the solution before that gate was considered complete. And so that's what I'd recommend, is tag it, and potentially we might even say you don't need, like, this is a false positive, and leave a comment explaining why. So that's another possibility of how it would resolve.
And then how is that managed then? I mean, obviously on the individual issue, like you could see, oh, this was resolved, but how is that managed then on the test side? Because that test is now presumably going to fail.
So what I would recommend is that you can bypass on a, per iteration. So in whatever context the test is failing, you could bypass that specific check for that specific rule. It would be accompanied by a comment that says we are bypassing it because we concluded in /node 7787 that this was a false positive. And I'd want the test to be as narrowly scoped as possible, so we're not inadvertently skipping valid violations of accessibility. But I do think it's important to mention that is a possible path, because especially with something as abstract, it can sometimes be quite abstract, the accessibility testing. False positives might happen, and there is a way out of that. And the accessibility maintainers will help you.
So to continue going down this path, do you see value? So I think it's great to have that documented directly in the test, right? And documented in the issue. But I'm wondering if you think that there's value in having some sort of accessibility dashboard, maybe, that says, like, hey, these are the kinds of things these are the tests that are, because I think it's helpful to see patterns sometimes. Like, these are the tests that are currently bypassed, and here's why. So you can see, like, if somebody's working on something new, they know, like, hey, this is going to falsely flag something. So yourself or another accessibility maintainer, maybe you don't have to investigate fully each time. You can like review as somebody working on an issue. I might be able to review that dashboard and be like, hey, this looks like it's this, and you have some frame of reference to work from. Or is it really just kind of each individual issue is treated separately?
It sounds cool. And so, and then there's this part of me that's like, am I going to have to build it?
I'm not trying to make more work.
Oh yeah, right. No,
work.
It's just
two minor things. Switch to Cypress and build an accessibility dashboard for Core. No.
So what I would recommend is kind of treating the ultimately the actual Nightwatch accessibility tests are not that big. The surrounding infrastructure for it and like the install profile, most of the merge request for that is that, but the tests themselves are pretty streamlined. So in lieu of a dashboard, you can look at those tests and get a pretty good sense of like what's a known issue, what's not. Now, granted, that's from the perspective of somebody who's worked on that issue. So I wouldn't expect other people to know that's the ad hoc accessibility dashboard, but at the very least, there is kind of a canonical record of that in the form of the source code.
Okay.
I want to just jump in and add, like, the accessibility maintainer group, I would say, like Mike, and there is the idea of, we talked about before, like, so there's a VPAT template, right? The volunteer product accessibility template, and then the machine version of that called OpenACR. That tries to, the goal of that document to keep it up to date is to try to capture all the Drupal accessibility issues, right? Which ones it supports, what's like the known issues. So that still might be at least one place to catalog what are the things that are ongoing that we want to resolve, what are things that are false positives, I think can be captured in that document. And then it's just about maintaining that report.
Okay.
So as our listeners are hearing this today, we've talked a lot about Nightwatch and how that's being used in Drupal core. Someone excited to look at it and potentially implement it in their project. Where do you recommend listeners to go to get up to speed in Nightwatch quickly?
Couple of resources I put down there. So starting with the Drupal.org page about JavaScript and Nightwatch test. The next one is the Matt Galman's post about getting DDev going with Chrome driver and then running your Nightwatch test locally. Those are two recommendations. And then I would also credit to, I don't know, pronounce her last name a little badly, Ricky Boshev, which had the solution of the first example of Drupal accessibility core tests. She has a great blog post as well on like how do you get Nightwatch and accessibility tests going in your Drupal project. Those are resources that got me unblocked and got me going with this merge request example. So I think that'll be a good starting for others to try out. And then Nightwatch documentation and Cypress documentation for a lot of good examples there.
Okay, we'll put a link to Nightwatch in the show notes as well. Well, Daniel and Ben, thank you for joining us. This has been a great talk. I have renewed appreciation for, for accessibility testing and the work that you guys do on core and making sure that the project itself is accessible. I certainly appreciate the benefit of knowing that core is mostly accessible. Apparently there's an issue on the login page, but I do appreciate that.
Yeah.
I mean, the only one that I know about is that the pager, like the views pager has an H4 in it, and 99% of the time it's in the wrong order. So I almost always just change the role and change it from an H4 to a div or something. That's one of the first template changes I make in almost every theme. I just think that where it's being tested, it's after an H3, so it's right. But that's not true in most implementations.
Have you not submitted a patch to change that?
So no. So here's the thing. I've
changed it on 50,000 projects, but I haven't submitted a patch.
No, I will admit it's one of those things where I feel nervous about making that because maybe I'm wrong.
Start the conversation, man.
Yeah.
Conversation would be good about that. Maybe it shouldn't be a header, or it should be like something else. Right?
That's a good accessibility question, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I have to credit Chris from Redfin too, because I think he's the one that first alerted me to look for that.
Yeah.
So I will look for that issue, and if it doesn't exist, I will create it. But yeah, thank you for joining us. Always a pleasure to chat about accessibility and automated testing.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
And you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. Okay, as we wrap, Ben, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, have any questions about Nightwatch in core or anything else, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
It would either be Drupal Slack or via the contact form Drupal user. It's Benjamin M without the vowels, and I will probably get it wrong if I say it out loud, but BNJMNM, I believe. And I'm checking those pretty much 18 hours a day. So yeah.
And Daniel, how about you?
I would also second Drupal Slack. I think it would be a good place. Either the accessibility Slack channel or just direct message for sure. And then, contact form on Drupal.org.
How about you, Stephen?
Twitter is probably the best place. Stephen Cross on Twitter. No, with a PH.
And John, how about you?
I'm John Picozzi on all the major social networks and Drupal.org and Drupal Slack. And so that would be the best place to get a hold of me. You can also find out more about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at NixVan, NICXVAN.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.
See you guys next week.
Later.